we dispone con gente e si vuole vita con tutti i valori di mondo. Dio, il nostro nome Padre, volemo che tu Ali Krigan Kefir, Dr. Samuel Sapientia, Ali Alvin Samuel Ciencia, the Spirit, Alter Fides, Miguel Spirit, Ali Gracia, Ignacio Spirit, Ali Horatio Virtutum, Ali Profecia, Ali Discretio Spiritum, Ali Genera Igual, Ali Revelatio Simon, Egatum Omnia Operatio Fumus, Acre Idem Spiritus, Dividend Sinus Voto. The Spirit dominates the Holy, to whom I am one holy name. They will go to school to eat the name, Gloria, hopefully to Vina Divina. Hallelujah, hallelujah. They eat the David in the day of Sion, in the way of God of Jerusalem. Hallelujah. Deus, Son, Deus, Agnus Dei, Aurora, Deus, Gratias, Agos, Vivi, Quia non Sigur Secri, Omnium, Fractores, Justi, Adulteris, Adulteri, Velus, Aetiamis, Tricam, Eulon, Ibis, Installator, Decima, Sido, Omnium, Quae, Possidio, et Publicanus, Alonde, Stan, Noteva, Noleva, Nec Oculos, Alcelum Levare. Sed Crucieva, ne pectus tuum, dicens, Deus Christus exo, nisi peccatori, Nico vobis decendit, qui justificatus in domum suam abilo, via omnis qui se exaltet, cum liabitur, qui se luia exaltabitur. Today, the 10th Sunday of Pentecost, St. Mary's. And the next Sunday there will be Mass at 8 o'clock in the morning. The next Sunday there will be Mass. And the Father, that will be here. So next Sunday there is Mass, and then there'll be a little kind of camp for the catechism. In the epistle for this 10th Sunday of Pentecost, taken St. Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 12. Brethren, you know that when you were heathens, you went to dumb idols, according as you were led. Wherefore I give you to understand that no man, speaking by the Spirit of God, says anathema to Jesus. No man can say the Lord Jesus, but by the Holy Ghost. Now there are diversities of graces of the same Spirit. There are diversities of ministries of the same Lord. And there are diversities of operations of the same God, who worketh all in all. And the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man unto profit. To one indeed by the Spirit is given the word of wisdom, to another the word of knowledge, according to the same Spirit. To another the grace of healing in one Spirit. To another the working of miracles. To another prophecy. To another discerning of spirits. To another diverse kinds of tongues. To another interpretation of speeches. But all these things one and the same Spirit worketh, dividing to everyone according as he wills. And the gospel, taking that according to the same chapter 18. At that time Jesus spoke this parable to some who trusted themselves with guts and despised others. Two men went up into the temple to pray. The one was a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee standing prayed thus within himself, O God, I give thee thanks that I am not as the rest of men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, as also is this publican. I fast twice in a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not so much as lift up his eyes towards heaven, but struck his breast, saying, O God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I say to you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other, because everyone that exalted himself shall be humbled, and you humble himself shall be exalted. That's the word of today's Holy Gospel. Today, a few considerations. More appropriate with Pope Francis a few days ago, now less than a month, July the 16th, and that was August the 1st. And that motu proprio Benedictus Custodes, and that this motu proprio has put great restrictions on the Latin Mass, and is in the next stage in the development of the whole Indo movement and the revolution of destroying the Catholic faith. And today, a consideration in just a moment on the response of Bishop Sanborn to the motu proprio, an appeal that he made from the State of the Conscious World to essentially take the opportunity of the motu proprio of Pope Francis to get souls to join the State of the Conscious movement. Bishop Williamson said in a comment the other day, well, that it would be very dangerous because many souls are tempted because of how evil Pope Francis is being, how much he shows his hatred of the Latin Mass tradition, and how wicked he appears openly to be. And this motu proprio Traditionis Custodes is the latest example of it, that some are saying they've had enough and they're going into the error of civic conscientism. And Bishop Williamson said that's not good, you shouldn't do that, but without any further explanation. And then also just yesterday, I intended to preach on this, but just last night, Archbishop Vigano made a statement finally concerning the Traditionis Custodes, when we read about a 1-hour statement that he made, and concerning the Traditionis Custodes. And in this 1-hour statement, he essentially speaks about the evil of Pope Francis, how Pope Francis has shown himself to be a very evil pope. In fact, he calls him Bergoglio and Bergoglio and Bergoglio rather than calling him Pope Francis, even though he does say that he's sitting in the chair of Peter. And but he doesn't call him Pope Francis, but rather Bergoglio. And that he has been friendly with the enemies of God, friendly with the enemies of the church, friendly with the enemies of morality, but extremely cruel to those who are trying to stand for tradition. In the middle of his note, he said, Pope Francis, or rather Bergoglio, he says, Pope Francis, he is being very cruel and wicked and pulling out the whip to all those priests within the church who are saying the motu proprio masses. And yet Pope Francis is being very gentle and kind and understanding and friendly to the Society of St. Pius X. And he made a note of that in his little speech last night. And why does he do that? Because the Society of St. Pius X is independent, is financially independent, and set up independent from the diocese. And therefore, Pope Francis is being nice and understanding and gentle and friendly to the Society of St. Pius X. Whereas exactly at the same time, anyone else saying the Latin Tridentine Mass, anyone else trying to stand for the Catholic truth and tradition, he is pounding them and beating them with whips and with scorpions. So he made that note also. And also one good point Archbishop Agostino made in this little speech last night, it was released last night. He said that there are two rails of the same track. And then one rail is the government rail, by which an experimental and wicked vaccine is being forced upon us, and the citizens are having their rights taken from them. And this is the rail of the state. And the other rail of exactly the same track is the rail of the crushing of the Latin Trinity Mass in Catholic tradition in the Catholic Church. And these two tracks lead to the great prophet, meaning the Antichrist, and the global one world order. And so when Dr. Agostino said that, he said the perfect truth. That in fact, he said they are two rails of the same track. In other words, the Satanists that are ruling the governments of the world, and the Satanists that are ruling and fulfilling the prophecy of Our Lady of La Salette, that Rome shall become the seat of the Antichrist, that the same wicked leaders are guiding both the destruction of the faith within the Catholic Church and the destruction of the world, of the citizens of this world. It's only one movement, and that is the movement of Satan and Satanism. And so he pointed that out also in his talk, and then the 1 hour talk, we don't remember all the details. Those are elements that came out from the talk of Archbishop Agostino last night. But the names of considerations primarily, once again, a response to Bishop Sanborn in his communication last week concerning the motu proprio of Pope Francis to Traditionis Custodes. And he began with a brief history of tradition. A brief history of tradition. That there are three movements in tradition. Three traditional movements. Going back to the very beginning, Archbishop of Vatican II happened. There was a reaction to Vatican II, and that Archbishop of Lefebvre founded the Society of St. Pius X, and it became a beacon of the movement, the fight against the Novus. And at that time, they didn't realize it was going to go on so long. And at that time, they called the enemies of God liberals. They didn't realize they were far worse than that. They were modernists and actually apostates outside of our church. And so each person thought that way. So he didn't blame Archbishop Lefebvre for the mistake that he made of trying to work with Rome in the beginning. But Archbishop Sanborn says, but as time progressed, as we travel through time, it's understandable in 1970, only a few years after Vatican II, to try to coexist with the liberals, to try to coexist with the modernists. It's understandable. Because we want them to convert, because we don't realize how bad they really are, and because it takes time to begin to realize how much they have lost the faith and are in another religion than the one given to us by Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. So he says there are three reactions of a traditional movement, three types of traditionalists. The first are those traditionalists who are in the indult world. Those traditionalists who want to keep the Holy Roman Catholic faith intact, who want to stay faithful to the tradition of our fathers. But what happens? They realize we are in a structure of the church, and we must obey the structure of the church, and we have to be in the structure. Therefore, in order to keep our faith, it is required that we obey Rome. We must obey Rome. And these are the indult communities. And then the second group is the Society of St. Pius X. And these are those who Bishop Sanborn says, they are the ones who say the hierarchy, we must disobey everything that the hierarchy tells us to do since Vatican II. We must stand firm for our holy faith, and we can't go along with any of the modernism that is in the church, but we recognize the hierarchy as the hierarchy of the church. We recognize the Pope as the Pope. We recognize the bishops as bishops of the church. We recognize them as members of the church. We put a picture of Pope Francis in the vestibule. You mention the name of the Pope and the canon, you say, and also the name of the local bishop, and then therefore you are under the local bishop, but in reality, they pay no attention to the Pope. In reality, they pay no attention to the local bishop. And the example that Bishop Sanborn used is like John and Mary. You see John and Mary outside. And John says, I'm with Mary. We're together. We are one. And Mary says, I'm not with John. I have nothing to do with him. I hate his guts. And I have nothing to do with him. We are not together. Now, if John says he's with Mary, but Mary says she's not with John, it takes two to be together. It takes two to be together, and don't forget in this relationship between the SSPX and Rome, the more important member of the relationship is the Pope. He's the more important one. So the Pope says to SSPX, you're not with me. Well, the SSPX says, you're with me. The SSPX says that the Rome is with the SSPX, but Rome says no. And this, of all the three positions, he says, is the most absurd. And then the third position. Bishop Sanborn says the third position, which he claims is the true one, is that we must recognize that the church is indefectible. Indefectibility is a dogma of the church, about which we know the church can never change from what it was 2,000 years ago at any time through its history, and God will protect it from changing. And the essential, what makes substantially the church to be the church is the profession of the faith. And we see the Vatican II hierarchy since the 1960s. In Vatican II, we see that there is a new hierarchy, the hierarchy of the church. What is it doing? The hierarchy of the church, Pope and bishops, not just the Pope, but the Pope and the bishops of the dioceses throughout the world. The Pope and the bishops are teaching another dogma, they are practicing another set of morals, and another discipline, which is 100% completely diametrically opposed to the morals, discipline, and doctrine of our Holy Roman Church as it was founded by our Lord Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago, and as it has gone for the last 2,000 years. Therefore, the only response of a Catholic is to recognize, because of the indefectibility of the church, clearly, this new hierarchy, which has a new mass that is leading souls to hell, which has a new doctrine leading souls to hell, that this is not the hierarchy of the church founded by Jesus Christ. And therefore, we cannot coexist with them. We must completely separate ourselves from them and have nothing to do with them. And then he finishes the sermon by making an appeal before reading from St. Paul, on a passage from St. Paul. He says, should not we, people of the traditional movements, should not we come together in rejection of this false hierarchy and say, yes, we have made a serious mistake in trying to be one with them. It hasn't worked. Yes, the latest example is the Indo movement tried its best to be obedient to Pope Francis, to Pope John Paul II, to Pope Paul VI. They tried to be obedient as possible, Pope Benedict XVI. And then what happened? Everything was taken from them. They lost everything. Clearly, they cannot be the hierarchy of the church, and this is a matter of faith because it goes against the indefectibility of the church. This is the essential argument of Bishop Sanborn a little while ago. And it's made standard argument of safety conscience. Now on to considerations. Go through these three movements again. We'll note the one thing that Bishop Sanborn does say, from his perspective, and Father Chicali said the same thing when he was alive, from his perspective, the Indo position is logical, and the safety conscience position is logical. Because either the Pope is the Pope and the bishops are the bishop, and therefore you must obey the hierarchy and you cannot disregard it. therefore you must go along with the noble sort of. Or they are not the hierarchy, and you must disobey them. Therefore, it makes sense. And it does. They are both the same error. They are both the same lie. They are both based on the same heresies. One side of the coin is the Novosordov, the other side of the coin is the SSPX. And they're the same exact error. And the error is that we must obey the hierarchy when the hierarchy gives us commands because they are the hierarchy. If the hierarchy is truly of God, then God will never allow, he says in his sermon last week, God will never allow that the church leads souls astray. And yet we look down the last 2,000 years of history, and it has happened multiple times. You look through the 4,000 years of history of the Old Testament, and it happened multiple times. You look through the prophecy of our Lord Jesus Christ in the gospel, and he said two things. One, he said, the faith will spread through the entire world. And the same Jesus Christ said, when I return, will there be any faith remaining? So the faith will spread through the entire world according to Jesus Christ. But then when he returns, will there be any faith left? So at some point, according to our Lord Jesus Christ, the Holy Mother Church and the members of that church who are spreading the faith throughout the entire world will begin to spread lies. And the Blessed Virgin Mary said that in La Salette 150 years ago, that Rome will become the seat of the Antichrist. Our Lady of Fatima said 100 years ago that there will be a great loss of faith, a great crisis in our church. The souls will be fallen to hell like snowflakes. And when we look at the history of the church, we find that there are multiple times in which the church leaders, the hierarchy, have used their authority to bring souls to Satan and not to God, and to lead the church as a whole away from God. The greatest example of this is Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the head of the true church, the same church in which we belong. And he led the Jewish people as a nation against Jesus Christ, which the only purpose of that nation was to have Jesus Christ as the Messiah come from it. And when our Lord Jesus Christ, the Messiah, came, what happened? The Jewish priests and the Jewish leaders used all their influence and power to bring the Jewish people as a whole away from Christ and to bring Christ to death. That's what happened. 2,000 years later, what do we see? The Catholic priests and the Catholic bishops and the Catholic Pope are using their power as much as they can as a whole, always there are exceptions, as a whole, to bring souls away from Christ again and to crucify Christ again. It turns out there's nothing new under the sun. That just as in the past, the priests and the prophets of God used their power to bring souls away from God, so they can do it again now in the future. And to say that they are not the hierarchy is completely false. Also, Bishop Sanborn argues from indefectibility that since the modern church in Rome is teaching modernism and is giving us a new mass, which is demonic, and giving us the wicked teaching, which is diametrically and completely opposed to Christ, therefore, they cannot be the church because the church is indefectible. What is the answer to that? Indefectibility, when we say the church is indefectible, it means the church will be essentially of the same constituent elements that it was when founded by Christ, which is a visible society consisting of pope, bishops, called the church teaching, priests and faithful, called the church learning, ecclesia docens and the ecclesia decens, and that this divine hierarchy will remain visible from the time that St. Peter began to be Pope on Pentecost Sunday until the ending of the world. This divine hierarchy shall not be taken away. And if it is, the church shall have defiance. According to Bishop Sanborn, that in 1958, when Well, Pius XII died, which is now getting close to 70 years ago, 60 years ago, that there has been no pope ruling our church. There have been no bishops ruling our church. When he says bishops, he does not mean bishops that are just consecrated or ordained. So that no bishops that are consecrated like myself, or like Bishop Sanborn, or like Bishop Williamson, we bishops don't count. We mean the bishops who are the authorities in the church, which we call ordinaries. These bishops are the ones with which we speak. The bishops that have jurisdiction in the church. The bishops that are the successors of the apostles in the sees of the dioceses throughout the world. And every diocese throughout the world, as in 100% of them, all the bishops except Pope Francis as the head of the church, and before that, Benedict XVI, all the way back to the time of the apostles. We find that every one of these bishops accepts the Bishop of Rome as the head of the church. Now, if these bishops who have done this are not part of the church, then that means the hierarchy of the church is gone. And therefore, the church has failed. So you have two arguments. Either the church has lost its faith, in which case it has failed, and that is the argument of Bishop Sanborn, or it has lost its hierarchy, in which case it has failed, and that is the answer. And both statements are not true. First of all, the church has not lost its faith. The faith remains in the church. In the indefectibility of the church, when we say that the church is indefectible, what that means is it will never lose its essential constituent elements. That the church will not lose its divine teaching, so that in the church today, the official teaching of the church remains the same as it has always been. It has not changed. The heresies and errors of Vatican II and the heresies promoted by the bishops today are not being promoted with the authority of the church. They are being promoted with human authority and not with divine authority. From the time that Jesus Christ founded his church until today, no pope has ever required Catholics to believe a heresy. No pope has ever required all Catholics to practice something absolutely wicked, including, for instance, even the new Mass. The new Mass is not even properly promulgated, and furthermore, the new Mass is only for the Latin Rite and not for the whole church. Therefore, not protected by the infallibility of the church, or indefectibility of the church. And so the fact is that the saying that there is no hierarchy, if there truly is no hierarchy in the church, then the church is dead. Where is the hierarchy? Where is the hierarchy? The Pope, for 60 years, no Pope. For 60 years, no bishops ruling our church. We have had many times wicked bishops, and we have had wicked popes. We have had many times wicked leaders in the Old Testament, and we have also wicked leaders in the New Testament. And God prophesied that this would happen in his church. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a sower that went out to sow seed, and until the ending of the world, there shall be cockle and there shall be wheat together in that garden, in the kingdom of heaven. There shall always be wicked and good within the church. There shall never be only the good. And the good will never be able to completely separate themselves from the wicked until the time that they go to heaven. We're going to have to combat the wicked and deal with the wicked as long as we are in this life. And then there was the Bishop Sanborn does the question of Judy, John, and Mary. If John says that he is with Mary, but Mary says that she is not with John, then they're not together. Response. If John and Mary got married in front of a priest, and John and Mary had two witnesses of their marriage, and John and Mary were truly married before a priest, when John says to Mary, "You are my wife," and Mary says to John, "No, you're not, I'm marrying Caitlyn Jenner." Now, when Mary says that she is no longer the wife of John, but she is going to marry Caitlyn Jenner, Mary is wrong. Mary is the wife of John, And what God has joined together, no man asunder. And her particular statement that John is not her husband, but Caitlyn Jenner is her husband, that statement is complete baloney before God and before any rational man. Therefore, the analogy of John and Mary does not work. Finally, Bishop Sanborn gives an excellent analogy. The final analogy that he gives before concluding his sermon, he says the church has been hijacked. The church has been hijacked. And that the first hijackers that came, normal hijackers, look like thugs. They invade an airplane, they take it over with guns, and you know they are hijackers. But there has come a hijacking of the church, which is now different from that kind of hijacking. And this hijacking of the church is that they decided to join and become real pilots. And then others decided to join and become real flight attendants and stewardesses. And then, after many years of delivering people to their correct destinations, they took over the plane. And this is what's happened to our church, and they are truly not pilots and flight attendants. What is the answer? Very simple. In the case of the first case of hijackers, foreigners came on the plane and took over the plane. That's a normal hijacking. In the second case of the pilot and the stewardess is deciding to fly the plane into a mountain, who is the pilot? He is a United pilot flying for United Airlines. I mentioned the example the other day. He is a United pilot flying for United Airlines. He is a pilot of United Airlines. He joined United Airlines so that he might crash an airplane eventually. What did he do? He joined United Airlines. He can be compared to many, many Catholics who got married. They were non-Catholics, and they had to marry a girl because she was Catholic, and so they joined the Catholic Church. They got baptized, but they never intended to really live a Catholic life. They are real Catholics. They got baptized. They intended to be Catholic. They just didn't want to live a Catholic life. But they are true Catholics. They are truly baptized. They're true members of the church. And whatever time that they repent of their sin, all they need to do is go to confession. They don't need to be rebaptized. They should not be rebaptized. They are already members of the church. The pilot is already a member of United Airlines. He's already been a pilot of United Airlines for many years. The stewardesses have been stewardesses for many years. They are a real pilot and real stewardesses on a real airplane. And they decide to fly the plane into a mountain. What do you do if you're on that plane? Does any conduct response is to stand up and say, that's not a pilot, and that's not a stewardess. And therefore, we have the right to stop them from flying the plane into a cliff. Because he's not a pilot, he's not a stewardess. Because if he was a pilot, he would have the right to fly it into a cliff. Therefore, I would have to obey him because he's a United pilot. He's flying a United Airlines plane, and he wants to fly it into a cliff. If I accept that he is a pilot, and I accept he belongs to United Airlines, then I have to agree I cannot in any way stop him from flying the plane into a cliff. Even though I'm a retired pilot myself, I can easily fly the plane correctly. Nope, I can't do that because he's part of United, and I don't have the right to interfere with United's rules and policies, and I don't have the right to stop a pilot from flying into a cliff. The answer to this is made in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 5. We obey God rather than men. That there is a rule in hierarchy. The pilot is the pilot of United Airlines. He is flying the plane. And before God, he has a right to fly planes and United Airlines. United has rules. We fly from one United airport to another United airport, and we land on the runways. Mountains are not on the list of places to land. And if they try to land in a mountain, this will cause a lot of expense for United Airlines. It'll cause death to the people on the plane, and it is not the purpose of a pilot. Therefore, there is a policy there that if the pilot of United Airlines tries to fly the plane into a cliff, the passengers can fight against the pilot. They can enter into the main cabin, and they can take him off of the steering wheel, and they can take over the plane and fly it safely to its destination. That is what they can do. And they don't need to say he's not the pilot. He's not the pilot. They're not the flight attendants. So likewise in our Holy Mother, the Church, when the Pope, who is the true successor of St. Peter, commands me to believe an error or heresy, or commands me to do something immoral, I am obliged to disobey him. If he uses his power to destroy the church, I am obliged to fight against him. And there is no time limit to this fighting. I have the right and power to say no to a wicked command, to resist wicked movements. But I do not have the right or power to remove him from positions of authority. The people on the plane, they cannot say, Pilot, you are now fired from United Airlines. Only the CEO of United can fire him. But we can say, Pilot, today you're not flying the plane. Today we're not going to obey your steering of the plane. We're going to fight against it because we have the right to save our own lives. And we have the right to guide this plane safely to a destination. But we're not questioning your authority as a pilot. If you want to be a normal pilot and fly the plane safely, we'll go sit back in our seats. But if you are not going to fly the plane safely, then we must combat what you are doing for the sake of the good of the whole plane. So likewise, it is the duty in our Holy Mother Church today for the members of the crew of our Holy Mother Church, the members of the mystical body of Christ, to fight against the errors and heresies of Vatican II. It is not for us to dethrone the Pope. It is not for us to dethrone the bishops. It is only God and the Pope. Only the Pope can dethrone bishops, and only God can dethrone the Pope. So we do not take the position of our authorities. We do not take the position of authority over our authorities. We recognize the divine constitution of the Church remains indefectible in our present crisis. And the Church still is the Church. It still is the mystical body of Christ. It still has its divine visible authority of Pope and bishops, priests and faithful. And we know that the Pope, bishops, priests, and faithful can all four be sinful. They can all four work against God, and yet they will never succeed in their combat against God. God always gives us a way out. God always gives us a means to overcome the assaults of the enemy and to protect ourselves in the battle. And by just simply understanding the proper rule of the virtue of obedience. That is, I cannot obey excessively commands that I should not obey, nor defectively can commands that I should obey. If I am obliged to obey my superior, I cannot disobey him when I should, and I cannot obey him when I should not. That's a simple rule of obedience. It is a virtue. Virtue means to act according to right reason. It is a free will act. Obedience is one of the virtues. To claim obedience is the satanic rule. The satanic law of obedience is you do whatever you're told because you're told, and that is the only reason. St. Thomas tells us, if I do what I'm told only because I'm told, and not because it's right, not because it's in accord with the law of God, but just because I'm told to do it and I don't care, that act of obedience becomes a mortal sin. I can't just obey because I'm told. Blind obedience is a mortal sin against the virtue of obedience. All Catholics are forbidden to have blind obedience. We must obey according to right reason. And this is included in the statement of St. Paul, where he says, if we ourselves or an angel of heaven teach you another gospel than the one that we have already taught you, let him be anathema. Let him be anathema means let him be condemned. Doesn't mean he's not a pope. Doesn't mean he's not a king. Doesn't mean he's not a bishop. Doesn't mean he's not baptized. It simply means let him be cursed. Let him be cursed. I am going to continue to do that which I must do, and let him be cursed. Does not take him away from his authority or his position. God gave the authority, that God can take it away. But I don't take away that authority. And furthermore, it is implied by that statement that we can know what we were taught to do. We can know our catechism. We can know what we were taught, and we must know what we are taught in our catechisms. And if we are taught to do something different, then we must say no. So understanding the virtue of obedience is sufficient. Therefore, the Society finds its position, which is to recognize the hierarchy as a hierarchy of God, because it was put there by God. This Pope is Pope number 265 or 266. He sits in the same chair the Pope sat before him. And if these modern popes, these last 6 popes, were not popes, and yet there seem to be popes, it would mean that Christ's prophecy of 2,000 years ago was not true. And his prophecy is true. They truly are popes. They truly are holy fathers. The Bishop of Kansas City, Kansas, truly is the Bishop of Kansas City, Kansas. He truly is a bishop. He truly does have authority. And we must disobey him because he's saying the new Mass, which is an abomination. Because he's wanting us to follow Vatican II, which no good Catholic can follow. And therefore, we're obliged to disobey him in order to obey God, who the Bishop of Kansas City is subject to, just like any other bishop. Understanding obedience is sufficient to be able to handle this crisis, and God has given us the tools to be able to make it through it. The latest wickedness of Pope Francis in the motu proprio Traditionis Instades demonstrates the problem of the false kind of coexistence that the Indo has. And that is, they believe they must obey commands even when the command, in order to be obeyed, requires a sin against the faith. Their Bishop Sanborn says, well, you can have your Latin Mass, but on the condition that you accept that which is diametrically opposed to God. Now, if you can have your Latin Mass, on the condition you have something diametrically opposed to God, you can do no good act on condition of a mortal sin. The end does not justify the means. We need to celebrate the Latin Mass. We need to attend the Latin Mass. We need to live according to our faith because it is the command of God and not because my superior allows it. Therefore, there is a mistake in the misunderstanding of obedience on the part of the position number 3 of Bishop Sanborn and the St. Vicandas, and the same exact mistake is made in position number 1 of the Indotarians, who both misunderstand the correct the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Holy Roman Catholic Church on the virtue of obedience. And that in order for us to act according to the law of God, we must act virtuously according to right reason. Obedience is simply one of the virtues by which we must practice. Virtual obedience requires that I obey men insofar as they obey God, insofar as they guide me according to their power and under the direction of God's commands. And if they go outside of that, I'm not required to obey. And if they go against that, I am required to disobey. And therefore, and these are the simple rules of obedience since the beginning of time, and they remain those until the end. In any case, I also pray for Bishop Vigano, who said some true things at the talk last night. He read his little speech last night. And one of the interesting points that he made is that it is quite a peculiar thing that Pope Francis, who is cruel to everyone traditional, cruel to everyone who wants to be good, is so nice to the Society of St. Pius X. And that brings up a huge, huge red flag. Why is it that he who smashes the Franciscan Immaculate, he who smashes sisters wearing their habits, he who crushes anyone who wants to say the Latin Mass, who wants it wiped out for the entire world, says, you SSPXers, you can keep saying it, you're nice, you're fine. Maybe it's because part of the battle plan of Satan is to get people who are not going to be able to have their indole masses and who don't give up the Mass altogether, that they go to the corral of the Society of St. Pius X, and there they find the wolves already live inside, and they're entering into another trap. So that this is something that's very disconcerting, that even Bishop Vigano notes it, that why is it that Pope Francis is so nice to the SSPX, so mean to everybody else? In any case, of course, I go through all. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. No. Orange. Questions on the table from there. Your course meeting the Ferrari, one day series, one day series, automatic series, one day sequence, or the very honest, yeah, this is completed through the tech of the right now, and you have it with time again. From yes, with us, if you are, tax office, I can say it from the daily sides, Espíritus Santos. En principio era al verbo, verbo Deus, Deus, verbo, open begon name, omnia cultivatum, testimony, written of vacuum, the word vacuum, inspired to the good of the one is right, testimony, trivial level, non after the doesn't error, but now on the level physical memory of family, nickel mechanics, compared to now one that you have the physical relation on the above, very high. The honor of grace, Lord, to be flooded our down, and blessed to thy own good. Hail Mary, full of grace, Lord is thee, blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Hail Mary, full of grace, Lord is thee, blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Hail Holy Queen, Mother of mercy, and God has us now. The day of God, and I shall believe. The day of the Lord, our God, and the blessing of God. Very good. And after this, I shall pray for us, the Holy Mother of God. Let us pray. O God, our refuge, thou people live by thy word, and Father Peter, all the saints, to the virgin of water, and the virgin saint, to the freedom and exaltation of Holy Church, through same Christ our Lord. Amen. Michael, the Archangel, may God forgive you and do all the rest of the